Welcome to our webinar on international trade and value chains, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the CFAIR Program Chair. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of our profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I just want to provide some background on today's topic. A country's level of development plays a significant role in shaping its domestic supply chains and can also contribute to the expansion of global value chains. Many experts suggest that such an expansion can result in more sustainable and resilient value chains, as well as enhance the productivity and efficiency of production structures. However, there are also perspectives advocating for a reevaluation of these global supply chains, emphasizing the importance of supporting domestic production through potential trade barriers. In an effort to explore these complex dynamics, CFAIR has invited 3 distinguished experts to engage in a discussion on how trade and the implementation of trade barriers could influence the U.S. economy. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with, next slide, Will Martin. Will is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, past president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists, and a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. Much of Martin's recent research has focused on the impacts of shocks such as food price changes, productivity growth, COVID-19, and farm programs on poverty and food security. Next slide. Ian Sheldon received his PhD in economics from the University of Salford in the United Kingdom in 1981. He served as a lecturer in economics at the University of Exeter in the UK from 1982 to 1990, before becoming an associate professor at The Ohio State University in 1990, where he currently holds the Anderson's Chair in Agricultural Marketing, Trade, and Policy. Next slide. Dr. Andrew Muhammad is Professor and Blasingame Chair of Excellence in Agricultural Policy in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. He brings considerable experience and research to the Blasingame Chair position, where he focuses on assisting decision makers in the evaluation of opportunities, policy, and programs on international trade. Next slide. Before we start, we wanted to explain how to ask questions during the webinar to make sure that you, the audience, knows how to engage. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display panel accessed by clicking on the question drop-down, as shown on the slide, and sending it to the organizer. Next slide. Now I'll hand the webinar over to Will, who'll start us off.
Oh, yeah, so it's a great pleasure to be presenting this work jointly with Erwin Karong from the GTAP Centre, Madhur Gautam, and Rob Voss. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about is the evolution of agricultural value chains as economies develop, some approaches to measurement and some results. So next slide, please. So in the poorest of economies, most economic activity takes place in agriculture. Poor farmers use produce their own inputs like fertilizer and fuel from inputs like manure and wood. Food production takes place, as it always does, on farm. Food processing, a lot of preparation of food, pounding yam and so on, food preparation, and then quite often production of clothing and shelter with farm inputs. But as incomes rise, we see a lot more specialization and trade of the type that Adam Smith talked about. The purchase of farm inputs like fertilizer, food processing and food service sectors expand. The United States is leading in that issue. Farm industrial products are processed off farm. Fibers, leather, wood products, if we're considering forestry as part of agriculture here. And trade in processed products rise. So the USDA, ERS pointed out some years ago that most US agricultural trade is now in the form of processed products. Next slide, please. So FAO has a conceptual framework for agri-food systems, which starts off, you have the agriculture sector, then the food system, the production, storage, post-harvest, transport, processing, distribution. Some of those inputs are non-agricultural. They're from activities we don't think of as agriculture. And then there are non-food outputs, which are often not counted, but I think are quite important for the economic well-being of the economy and agriculture. Next slide, please. Measuring the agri-food sector. Now, initially, well, you can't just add up the output. I mean, you can't add up wheat and flour. For instance, you're double counting if you do that. You need to use a value-added approach, and the central components, obviously agriculture, forestry, fishing, food processing, food services, trade and transport services. All of those are needed to deliver food to consumers. But then what about production of fertilizer and other inputs? We don't have information on how much resources goes into that production, how much value added. We know how much fertilizer is used, but not how much value added generated. And what about the downstream processing of fibers, leather, wood, and so on? Now, next slide, please. And I'm moving pretty quickly here. There are two broad approaches to assessing the overall amount of resources used in agricultural production and trade. There's an activity approach. You look at the value added in gross output of agriculture, food processing, food services. You have to identify separately trade and transport services. And then you've got to take some share of value added in input supplying and output using downstream sectors. There's a final demand approach. There's another alternative. You start with final demand for domestic and export uses, use input-output techniques to identify the factor inputs used, both directly and indirectly, and potentially look at forward linkages. Both of these require detailed input-output information. In this study, we're using GTAP data. We're using supplementary IO tables and the World Bank's gender disaggregated labor database to capture labor by skill level and by gender. We separate food services from hotels and food services, surprisingly rarely done in input-output tables, and yet clearly these are very different. Food service uses a lot of agricultural inputs, hotels not so much. Identified trade and transport services, which are buried oddly in input-output tables and the standard IO tables. They're not allocated to agricultural and food products. And these approaches, the IO approaches, allow us to link employment and wages by gender. Next slide, please. So an initial set of results here, if you look at agriculture, the green part, you're only seeing a small part these are shares of world GDP. We have the same for many regions. You've got to add food processing and food services, which globally and particularly in rich countries vastly outweigh agricultural production. And then you can look back and see input value added. A simple activity approach gives us the results in the third column, third bar. If we use the input-output approach, we're getting much more input use in input supply. And another extension is to look at the resources used in downstream processing, the forward linkages. Next slide, just to get an idea. So this way we can identify the wages paid to male and female workers, unskilled, and in this particular case, the importance of male versus female labour in each of the component sectors, and compare with other parts of the economy. And I know I'm almost out of time, so just to briefly conclude. Next slide, please. So I think it's vitally important to go beyond farm gate agriculture to agri-food value chains if we're interested in generation of income, employment, and so on. Basic agriculture is now a small fraction of agri-food, especially if we consider input GDP and potential backward linkages. This requires detailed data work with IO tables. They don't frequently allow us to do important things like separate hotels and food service. We think there's lots of potential for further insights into the importance of trade on employment and wages. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jane.
Thank you, Will, for that presentation. I just wanted to remind everyone to send questions to the organizer using the question drop-down menu. Now we'll be hearing from Ian. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks very much, Jane, and thanks, Will, for your interesting presentation. So I'm going to be talking at a fairly high level today about recent work that's come out in the economics journals on the impact of recent trade policy interventions and their impact on value chains. And then I'll try to draw out some, what I think are some important research questions that those of us who work in agricultural economic trade areas might like to think about, and that gives a lead into some of the work that I know Andrew Mohammed is going to present after my presentation. Next slide, please. So despite the growth of global value chains, international economists until fairly recently have not paid much attention to, empirically at least, to the potential disruption that trade policy could lead to in these value chains, other than a few years ago, Paul Antress and Bob Steger had a very nice piece in the American Economic Review where they talked about how value chains and the importance of free trade agreements in developing and helping value chains, how that might affect the way we think about trade policy. So I would suggest that until very recently, the focus in the high-level economics literature has predominantly been on a phenomenon called tariff escalation. And tariff escalation is where, as we move down a global value chain, and Will gave you an example of what a value chain might look like in agriculture, as you move down the value chain for both industrial and agricultural goods, those tariffs increase. So tariffs on intermediate inputs tend to be lower than tariffs on processed products. So in the case of agriculture, think about a tariff on cocoa butter, think about a tariff on a finished processed chocolate product. And this has been written about quite extensively in both the international economics and the agricultural economics. I just cite a couple of papers there, one by Caddo and colleagues in 2004, and then one by myself and my colleague Steve McCorrison that we published in the Review of Development Economics a few years ago. So if we look at the data, a very interesting paper by Shapiro in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2020, which was actually about more in the context of the environment, but he showed in that paper that if you look at the simple average of final goods tariffs, they tend to be much higher than average input tariffs. Next slide, please. So this graphic here on the vertical axis, you have tariffs on final goods. On the horizontal axis, you have tariffs on inputs, and you can see by these country pairings for data in 2007 that average final good tariffs between countries are clearly higher than average input tariffs. So there's clearly a lot of evidence for the extent of what's called tariff escalation. Next slide, please. So typically, tariff escalation has been analyzed in the context of, why do we observe it? So this is usually a a political economy type analysis. The basic argument is that downstream firms producing final goods want to protect their domestic market, but they want to get cheap inputs, and so they'll lobby for downstream tariffs and they'll lobby against upstream tariffs. But more recently, Pol Antras and his colleagues in a recent paper have made the argument analytically that it might be beneficial that if final goods are produced under increasing returns to scale, that there might actually be benefits from tariff escalation. So you get cheap inputs, you get protection downstream, you're able to expand and realize greater economies of scale. And so in that paper, it's interesting, at the back end of the paper, it's clear that the recent trade war between the United States and mostly with China, but also with other countries, you can think of that as a natural experiment for testing this hypothesis that there could be benefits from tariff escalation. So if you look at the data, due to low initial levels, average input tariffs have actually increased the most following the trade war, but tariff escalation has persisted. And the key result in that paper is that any gains that might be generated through tariff escalation, that would be increasing downstream tariffs as opposed to upstream tariffs, those were undermined by the fact that there was not only tariff retaliation, but there were also increases in upstream tariffs. Next slide, please. So these are the results from this is just a graphic from their paper. So on the left-hand side, you have US average tariffs on imports in the rest of the world. On the right-hand side, you get at the idea of retaliation by the rest of the world with their average tariffs on US exports to those countries. In each one of those graphics, on the left-hand side, you have the pre-trade war tariffs in the US, you have the post-trade war tariffs in the US, and the same on the right-hand side. And you can see the data show again the extent of tariff escalation before the trade war, and the fact that you get this big increase in the US anyways in intermediate good tariffs, but you still see that there's quite a good deal of tariff escalation. And that's also true of rest of the world tariffs on the United States. Next slide, please. In a very recent paper in the American Economic Review, Grossman and colleagues have done a really thorough analysis, both analytically and empirically, on why tariffs have a potential to disrupt global value chains. And they draw on an extensive literature that people like Pol Antras and Helpman have contributed to, that what's important when we think about global value chains is that as you construct these chains, there's a lot of search costs, who to find a trading partner to supply you with inputs. There are matching costs, how does the buyer match up with the supplier? Many of these contracts are incomplete and they often require renegotiation, which is costly. Pol Antras has a great paper in 2003 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics about that incompleteness, and this relates to draws on the theory of the firm. And then quite often these costs are sunk. In other words, once you have a pairing, it generates a lot of stickiness and makes it costly to renegotiate those contracts if tariffs get put in place that affect the supply of intermediate goods, in particular in these global value chains. So in their work, they argue that the size of any tariff increase affects the choice between a downstream firm renegotiating their existing contracts versus whether you have a higher tariff that would lead you to make new searches in new countries that are not affected by the tariffs. And they argue that there'll be a trade-off between any terms of trade effects. So a very large tariff on inputs could well drive down the cost of those inputs on the world market. And you have to trade that off against these additional renegotiation, additional search costs, additional matching costs. Next slide, please. And just to back up the idea that there has actually been some global value chain reorganization, This is a very interesting graphic. The red dotted line is where the trade war began. On the left-hand axis, you have the vertical axis, you have the import share of China versus other Asian economies. On the right-hand, on the bottom, on the vertical line, you have just the timeline, and the dark black line shows that clearly there's been a switch, certainly into the United States, of purchasing intermediate inputs from other parts of Asia as opposed to China. And this has been backed up by other studies by Alfaro and Shaw, and which was a paper given last year, I think, at the Jackson Hole meetings of central bankers. And it got quite a lot of publicity in the media. Of course, you have to remember, part of what's going on in here is that China itself is changing the shape of its own value chains. It's starting to outsource assembly and production in countries like Vietnam, and it's also investing in plants to produce final goods such as furniture, motor vehicle parts in Mexico, and then get product into Mexico through USMCA at lower tariffs than it would face if it directly exported to the United States. Next slide, please. So what Grossman et al. Find in their own empirical work is the trade war had the following effects. There was a modest improvement in US terms of trade that actually contrasts with some of the earlier studies of the trade war by Amiti and her colleagues. But this was offset by the relocation of input production to higher cost exporters, and also the fact that search costs were incurred. And what I found interesting about this paper was that they find that the loss to the United States of global value chain disruption from the trade war was about 0.12% of GDP. But what's really interesting is that that appears to be larger than the losses calculated by Pablo Feigelbaum and his colleagues in their paper in 2020, and also the paper I just mentioned by Amiti et al., where the losses were about 0.4% of GDP. So this disruption to global value chains has to be added to the effects on consumer prices and producer prices that we know from those earlier studies. So I think the interesting research question here is, how did food and agricultural global value chains, as described by Will in his presentation, how have they adapted to the retaliation, both in terms of the import side into the United States, but maybe more importantly on the export side for the United States because of that retaliation. We know from an earlier CFAIR webinar where I know Shauna Rita presented some results that showed you the impact on exports of soybeans and corn of the retaliation, particularly by China. But that study, or those studies, didn't really go deeper, both downstream and upstream in agricultural value chains. And I think that would be really important to do that. Final slide, please. Moving on to an area that I'm currently working on, but I think it's another issue that's very important to start thinking about, and that's global value chains and broadly what I call environmental policy. So there's a lot of focus on trade policy as an instrument of climate policy, and here I refer to the European Union's so-called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are going to be targeted at the import of carbon dioxide intensive imports. As Will has rightly pointed out in some of his own research, one of the problems with the EU's mechanism is that they pay no attention to rebating climate charges. The European trading mechanism for carbon emissions, there's going to be no rebates on exports. So I think he would argue that the EU system is probably going to be even more distorting of global value chains than maybe we realize. So in terms of agriculture, fertilizer imports are going to be affected by this, and the CBAM on fertilizer imports into the EU will include both direct emissions from fertilizer production and indirect emissions through electricity production that was used in the production of those fertilizers. The objective being to prevent leakage to countries that don't have such tough climate policy in place. Now, what I think is interesting is that at the moment, it's not the case, but the EU, at least in the Commission documents, have talked about extending CBAMs up and down the value chain. So back up the value chain would include transportation, things like mining, but downstream, for example, the EU CBAMs are going to affect imports of iron and steel into the European Union and aluminum. Both of those products are used in the manufacture of agricultural equipment, such as tractors and combines, et cetera, et cetera. There's a discussion about, do we move those border adjustments for imports further down the value chain? And so I think there's clear potential for affecting trade within global value chains beyond what I've just suggested with fertilizers. At the same time, other countries are considering these carbon border adjustment mechanisms here, and I just refer to the Clean Competition Act, which was introduced certainly on the House side here in the US. Whether it actually survives a new administration, that's open for debate, but that proposal looks very similar to the EU system. So I think the important research question is how will CBAMs affect food and agricultural global value chains? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Can you remind us what CBAM is?
A carbon border adjustment mechanism. Think of it as an adjustment at the border for imports of carbon intensive goods from countries that may not have emission trading schemes or a carbon tax in place domestically.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Next, I'd like to welcome our last presenter, Andrew Muhammad.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ian. And one of the things I'd like to do is to sort of apply the things that Ian discussed, but to think about it in the context of an actual sector in the United States that's been impacted by the trade war. And I've been doing some work as of late on US forestry, export sales, and what that has mean for the manufacturing sectors in Southeast Asia and China. And just to put this in context, US forestry export sales in the context of agricultural trade and exports, forestry would be a top 5 and certainly a top 10 export. So next slide, please. And so just sort of thinking about a very recent study by Feigelbaum in the American Economic Review Insights is this idea that the trade war and this imposition of tariffs on both sides, particularly the US and China, has led to sort of these impacts on what he referred to as sort of bystander countries. And these bystander countries obviously can come in either as horizontal competitors or as well as sort of both competitive and complementary activities along the supply chain. We've seen some issues with US cotton exports as of late, but what I'd like to talk to is just sort of the broader value chain in wood products, and particularly how we think about US forestry exports and global furniture trade, particularly between the US and China. Next slide, please. And so here's a quick slide to sort of how do we think about this particular value chain. And as furniture manufacturing and flooring manufacturing has declined in the United States over the last couple of decades, we've now become the sort of primary supplier of the input in this production process. So therefore, we ship logs and lumber to manufacturing firms in mostly in China up until the trade war, but also to Southeast Asia. This gets processed into furniture. Now that China has increased in terms of its economic or income per capita, a lot more of that furniture stays in China. But for the longest, and even to this very day, a big part gets re-exported. And a lot of that is re-exported back to the United States in the form of finished wood products, as well as re-exported to other developed countries in Europe. But the point is, China for the longest was sort of the primary supplier of finished wood products to the world, primarily supplied by US logs and lumber. Next slide, please. And so what did we see during the trade war? All right, and so it's pretty clear that both sides of the U.S.-China trade war did not consider the relationship between products. And so when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on finished wood products from China, no one necessarily thought about the implications for U.S. log and lumber exports to China. And clearly, when China retaliated against U.S. logs and lumber in their retaliatory tariffs, you could clearly see the government may not have been thinking about their own forestry exports to the U.S. in the world. And so you have compounding tariffs on sort of both sides of the global value chain, an increase in tariffs on the primary input and an increase in tariffs on the finished product in a major destination market. And what I'm interested in is sort of the impacts of this kind of compounding effect of trade war tariffs, but within the same value chain. Next slide. All right, just so from the perspective of U.S. forestry exports to China, mainly when we think about hardwood export sales such as oak lumber, cherry, oak, ash, maple, those products that are the primary inputs into furniture production and flooring production, as well as other finished wood products, you could see that the trade war tariffs on both sides were immediate, right? This overall decline in the very next year of about 45%. Some categories impacted more than others. It's only in some of these smaller categories, particularly pine, which obviously is a little separate from, say, the furniture sector, that has increased. But for the main and major exports, we saw immediately in the immediate following year, significant declines across the board. So what you see here are the various categories of exports to China in terms of log and lumber export sales, and in parentheses is either the range of tariffs or the actual tariffs imposed by China on these products. Next slide, please. And so for the most part, that this sort of depressed export sales as a result of the trade war has continued. And there's something to note that even with the phase one trade deal, where China committed to increasing purchases of U.S. agricultural exports, as well as exports in the manufacturing, services, and energy sector, forestry was listed under manufacturing. And many of you, if you know about the success of the phase one trade deal, the purchases of agriculture sort of by the Chinese government sort of was much closer to the target than manufacturing. We have yet to see any type of recovery in terms of forestry export sales to China, right? So China being the primary market for our log and lumber exports, and now you could see that immediately decreased when the trade war tariffs were implemented on both sides, and that market has yet to recover, as you could see from this slide. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the imports of finished wood products on the US side, we've seen similar declines in terms of imports from China, but growing imports from competing manufacturing countries. And so here's a major category in terms of US wooden furniture imports. So you could see here, these are sort of wooden furniture imports for kitchen use. You see this tremendous increase in imports from other countries as a result of the trade war tariffs and this significant decline in imports from China. Next slide, please. Here you see the same thing happening with other furniture categories. So this is other than bedroom use, other than, say, office use, but the same type of phenomenon. This decline in imports from China, increase in imports from the rest of the world, and it seems to have sort of taken place immediately after the trade war. Next slide, please. So I'll close with this, that this slide is to give us a much sort of longer picture here. So it's not necessarily just about the trade war. So as manufacturing companies move to China and then increase their demand for Chinese workers, wages increased in China, therefore making China relatively less competitive in terms of cheap production. And as a result, manufacturers were already sort of moving to places like Vietnam. So what did the trade war necessarily do? And you could see in this slide, what it did is it accelerated a growth in the movement of manufacturing firms from China to Vietnam. But you also see, if you look at this green line, this immediate impact in terms of imports from China, in terms of the furniture sector overall. When you see a decline that quick, a lot of this was sort of rerouted exports from China to Vietnam to avoid the tariff. But a big part of this was also middlemen and contractors moving to Vietnamese manufacturers and manufacturers in the rest of the world. And the last thing I'll say in closing, something that we could get to in the Q&A, is that a big part of what's going to drive this moving forward is European renewable fuel and environmental policy, most notably the EU deforestation-free supply chain policy, where this issue of how do you trace finished wood products like furniture to forests that were not degraded forests, and forests that sort of production that was not the result of, say, deforestation. And as we sort of think about that moving forward, you could really see, particularly the wood products supply chain, be significantly impacted by climate policy. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.